Hello and welcome, my name is Meepolis, they, she, he, and this is Literally Graphic. And today we're doing my second annual May Day video highlighting comics for the left. Obviously, May Day is on May 1st, and now we are at May 12th. What could I say? I'm only just barely holding on to my schedule as it is. Getting to actual content though, I was pretty excited when I was able to track down a second short comic about the history of May Day. Many people are still not familiar with the history of May Day as a day for labor, so I will definitely encourage you to check out this free 4-page simple summation, link below. And let us all pray that another comic is created this next year so I can keep up this tradition in 2023. One caveat I will offer is that the actual level of leftist/Marxist/anarcho theory being purposefully articulated in these comics does vary. I should probably try to read and review more overtly political comics, although they do have a reputation of not being terribly engaging. What all these comics do have to offer is a window into liberative struggle, largely from a first-person perspective. The other thing that connects these books together is that I read them since last May Day. Check out my previous video for early reviews, link in the cards. Since YouTube only lets you link to 5 videos though, if you want to check out the reviews of any of these books, look for the link in the description. To kick things off, let's start with an exception, namely Christie Pits by Jamie Michaels and Doug Fedrau, which I actually read before last May Day but failed to mention. Quote, a gritty ride through Toronto's immigrant neighborhoods, Christie Pits tells the incredible true story of when young Jewish and Italian immigrants squared off against Nazi-inspired thugs on the streets of Toronto. This is the history of a gruff and unrecognizable Canada, one of swastika clubs and public bigotry. A homemade swastika flag flown at a public baseball game was the spark that found tinder in this untenable and hateful condition. What followed was the worst race riot in Canadian history. Archival research and first-hand interviews lend historical depth to an unknown story of resistance against hatred in uncertain times. Moving along to this year, I figured we could start with the comics I filed under history. First off, we have Trinity, a graphic history of the first atomic bomb by Jonathan Fetter-Vorm, which I reread and reviewed a couple of months ago. Quote, Trinity, the debut graphic book by the gifted illustrator Jonathan Fetter-Vorm, depicts in vivid detail the dramatic history of the race to build and the decision to drop the first atomic bomb. This sweeping historical narrative traces the spark of invention from the laboratories of 19th century Europe to the massive industrial and scientific efforts of the Manhattan Project. Along the way, Fetter-Vorm takes special care to explain the fundamental science of nuclear reactions with the clarity and accessibility that only a graphic book can provide. Trinity transports the reader into the core of a nuclear reaction, into the splitting atoms themselves. The power of the atom was harnessed in a top-secret government compound in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where some of the greatest scientific minds in the world gathered together to work on the bomb. Fetter-Vorm showcases J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, and General Leslie Groves, the fathers of the atomic bomb, whose insights unleashed the most devastating explosion known to humankind. These brilliant scientists wrestled daily with both the difficulty of building an atomic weapon and the moral implications of actually succeeding. When the first bomb finally went off at a test site codenamed Trinity, the world was irreversibly thrust into a new and terrifying age. With powerful renderings of the catastrophic event at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Fetter-Vorm unflinchingly chronicles the far-reaching political, environmental, and ethical effects of this new discovery. Richly illustrated and deeply researched, Trinity is a dramatic, informative, and thought-provoking book on one of the most significant and harrowing events in history. End quote. Next up, I wanted to highlight Barefoot Jen by Keiji Nakazawa. I've only read volume 1 so far and released an initial thoughts video, but it's a powerful follow-up to Trinity. Not just about life after the bomb, Nakazawa draws on his own experience growing up in a family that resisted the Japanese government at that time. Quote, "This harrowing story of Hiroshima was one of the original Japanese manga series, new and unabridged. This is an all-new translation of the author's first-person experience of Hiroshima and its aftermath, and is a reminder of the suffering war brings to innocent people at the end. Its emotions and experience speaks to children and adults everywhere. Volume 1 of this 10-part series details the events leading up to and immediately following the atomic bombing of Hiroshima." End quote. A very engaging and recent look at an important point in the history of Black liberation in so-called North America, I couldn't not highlight The Black Panther Party, a graphic novel history by David F. Walker and Marcus Kwame Anderson. Quote, "A bold and fascinating graphic novel history of the revolutionary Black Panther Party from an award-winning comic book writer. Founded in Oakland, California in 1966, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was a revolutionary political organization that stood in defiant contrast to the mainstream civil rights movement. This gripping illustrated history explores the impact and legacy of the Panthers from their social, educational, and healthcare programs that were designed to uplift the Black community to their battle against police brutality through citizen patrols and frequent clashes with the FBI, which targeted the party from its outset. Using dramatic, comic book style retellings and illustrated profiles of key figures, the Black Panther Party captures the major events, people, and actions of the party, as well as their cultural and political influence and enduring significance." End quote. Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts by Rebecca Hall and Hugo Martinez. Another Black-centered history, Rebecca Hall weaves together the stories of women deliberately lost to history and her own struggle to try and pull them out of bureaucratic libraries and archives. Quote, "Women warriors planned and led slave revolts on slave ships during the Middle Passage. They fought their enslavers throughout the Americas, and then they were erased from history." Wake tells the story of Dr. Rebecca Hall, a historian, granddaughter of slaves, and a woman haunted by the legacy of slavery. The accepted history of slave revolts has always told her that the enslaved women took a backseat, but Rebecca decided to look deeper, and her journey takes her through old court records, slave ship captain's logs, crumbling correspondence, and even the forensic evidence from the bones of enslaved women from the, quote, "Negro burying ground," end quote. Uncovered in Manhattan, she finds women warriors everywhere. Using in-depth archival research and a measured use of historical imagination, Rebecca constructs the likely parts of Adono and Alela, women rebels who fought for freedom during the Middle Passage, as well as the stories of women who led slave revolts in colonial New York. We also follow Rebecca's own story as the legacy of slavery shapes life, both during her time as a successful attorney and later as a historian seeking the past that haunts her. End quote. Similarly, Footnotes in Gaza by Joe Sacco put history in not-so-stark contrast with the present. Quote, "Rafah, a town at the bottommost tip of the Gaza Strip, is a squalid place. Raw concrete buildings front trash-strewn alleys. The narrow streets are crowded with young children and unemployed men. On the border with Egypt, swaths of Rafah have been bulldozed to rubble. Rafah is today and has always been a notorious flashpoint in the bitterest of conflicts. Buried deep in the archives is one bloody incident in 1956 that left 111 Palestinians dead, shot by Israeli soldiers, seemingly a footnote to a long history of killing. That day in Rafah, cold-blooded massacre or dreadful mistake reveals the competing truths that have come to define an intractable war. In a quest to get to the heart of what happened, Joe Sacco immerses himself in the daily life of Rafah and the neighboring town of Khan Yunis, uncovering Gaza's past and present, spanning 50 years, moving fluidly between one war and the next, alive with the voices of fugitives and schoolchildren, widows and sheiks. Footnotes in Gaza captures the essence of a tragedy. As in Palestine and Safe Area Garazdi, Sacco's unique visual journalism has rendered a contested landscape in brilliant, meticulous detail. Footnotes in Gaza, his most ambitious work to date, transforms a critical conflict of our age into an intimate and immediate experience. End quote. And to conclude this section, I did want to suggest Red Rosa, a graphic biography of Rosa Luxemburg. Quote, Rosa tells the life story of philosopher, economist, publisher, writer, organizer, political leader, and martyr Rosa Luxemburg in full-color graphic form. The story follows Rosa from her family life in Jewish Poland, where she became the leader of a general strike at age 15 and was exiled from her homeland at 18 to her immersion into the then largest radical party in the world, the German Social Democratic Party, to her founding of the German Communist Party and leadership of the German Revolution of 1919. This beautifully drawn graphic life gives Red Rosa her due as an iconic radical, but also portrays a fascinating woman with a rich love life, struggling with physical disability, and abiding love of literature and theater. Rosa will contribute to the growing understanding of one of 20th century's greatest revolutionaries. End quote. Moving right along, the next section is loosely titled Pushing Back Against Colonization. First off, I was extremely excited to revisit and re-review Moonshot Volume 2, an anthology of Indigenous creators from across so-called North America. Quote, Volume 2 of the Moonshot collection centers around present-day Indigenous spirituality and tradition. You will see what life and wonder exists now on this earth, the spirit world, alternate dimensions, and more through this gorgeous collection of original Indigenous comics/graphic novel stories. Each of the 15 short stories included in this 200-page volume will be based on the tradition from the author's own tribe/community. These stories highlight present-day traditions and diversity in Indigenous people today, with each story adapted into comic book/graphic novel format by award-winning artists and illustrators. Moonshot Volume 2 is sure to amaze, intrigue, and entertain. End quote. Taking a slightly more science fiction bent, I would also recommend checking out Prism Stalker Volume 1 by Sloane Leong. Quote, far from the border of colonized space, a newly discovered planet teems violently with strange psychic life and puzzling telekinetic ecology. Vep, a refugee raised away from her devastated home planet, is an indentured citizen in a foreign colony, is taken by a private military firm to assist in settling the new planet. What awaits her will test the limits of her will as she grapples with the strange power the planet exerts over her. End quote. From Michael Nicoll Yahgulanaas, it was such a great pleasure to pick up Carpe Fin just a little while ago. Quote, in a prequel to the award-winning Red, a Haida manga, acclaimed artist Michael Nicoll Yahgulanaas blends Asian manhwa manga with the Haida artistic and oral tradition in another stunning, hand-painted volume. In a small near-future community perched between the ocean and the northern temperate rainforest, a series of disasters is taking a heavy toll. It is early fall, and a fuel spill has contaminated the marine foods the village was preparing to harvest. As food supplies dwindle, a small group decides to make a late-season expedition to search for sea lions. Surprised by a ferocious storm, they abandon one man, Carpe, on the isolated rock at sea. After 10 days, they are finally able to return, but he has vanished. The story follows Carpe's encounter with the Lord of the Rock, who demands retribution for Carpe's role in the hunt, and Carpe's fate in the half-life between human and animal life and death. End quote. Looking at the history of resistance across so-called North America, we have two young adult comics that I want to highlight. First, we have A Girl Called Echo by Katherena Vermette and Scott B. Henderson, a series of 4 succinct volumes that cover the history of Métis resistance to so-called Canada, with a time travel twist. Learn about the Pemmican Wars, the Red River Resistance, the Northwest Resistance, and the Road Allowance era. The second title is a graphic novel adaptation of a short story, namely Borders by Thomas King and Natasha Donovan. Quote, a stunning graphic novel adaptation based on the work of one of Canada's most revered and best-selling authors on a trip to visit his older sister, who has moved away from the family home on the reserve to Salt Lake City. A young boy and his mother are posed a simple question with a not-so-simple answer. Are you Canadian, the border guards ask, or American? Blackfoot. And when border guards will not accept their citizenship, mother and son wind up trapped in an all-too-real limbo between nations that do not recognize who they are. A powerful graphic novel adaptation of one of Thomas King's most celebrated short stories, Borders explores themes of identity and belonging and is a poignant depiction of the significance of a nation's physical borders from an Indigenous perspective. This timeless story is brought to vibrant, piercing life by the singular vision of artist Natasha Donovan. End quote. But before we conclude this section, I could not pass up the opportunity to highlight Come Home Indio by Jim Terry. Quote, a Native American cartoonist shares his journey from childhood through struggles with alcoholism to a spiritual awakening at Standing Rock. In this powerful graphic novel memoir by comics creator Jim Terry, the author shares the personal journey of discovering his spiritual home as a Native American from a childhood in suburbia, disconnected from his identity as an Indigenous person, through an urban adulthood marked by a struggle with alcoholism and the death of his parents, to his life-altering experience at Standing Rock. We are privileged to travel this path with the author as he begins to find a new sense of self as a Native and as an American. End quote. Next up is the section on prisons. I definitely dropped the ball on looking at comics that center prisons and the other branches of our culture of incarceration. The one comic I read this past year that did touch on legal systems and imprisonment was the manga What is Obscenity? The story of a good-for-nothing artist and her pussy. Not exactly the kind of book most of you would think of when talking about prisons, but extremely interesting and enlightening for me as someone who knows nothing about Japanese prisons. Quote, a graphic memoir of a good-for-nothing Japanese artist who has been jailed twice for so-called acts of obscenity and the distribution of pornographic materials, yet continues to champion the art of pussy. In a society where one can be censored, pixelated, and punished, Rokudan Nashiko asks what makes pussy so problematic. Rokudan Nashiko, good-for-nothing girl, is a Japanese artist. She is known for her series of decorated vulva molds, or dekuman, a portmanteau of decorated and monko, slang for vagina, distributing a 3D scan of her genitalia to crowdfunding supporters led to her arrest for alleged violations of Japanese obscenity laws. End quote. Moving along to immigration, I did read two titles that I thought I would recommend to you all. First, we have LaGuardia by Nnedi Okorafor, Tana Ford, James Devlin, and Sal Capriano. Quote, from Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Award winner Nnedi Okorafor, Who Fears Death, Binti Akata series, comes LaGuardia. Set in an alternative world where aliens have come to Earth and integrated with society, LaGuardia revolves around a pregnant Nigerian-American doctor, future Nwafor Chakwabuka, who has just returned to NYC under mysterious conditions after smuggling an illegal alien plant named Let Me Live through LaGuardia International and Interstellar Airports, Customs, and Security. She arrives at her grandmother's tenement, the New Hope Apartments in the South Bronx, where she and Let Me become part of a growing population of mostly African and shape-shifting alien immigrants battling against interrogation, discrimination, and travel bans as they try to make it in a new land. But as the birth of her child nears, future begins to change. What dark secret is she hiding? With the team behind Black Panther, Long Live the King #6, Nnedi Okorafor, and illustrator Tana Ford, Silk Duck, this hardcover collects the entire 4-issue miniseries of LaGuardia. End quote. And the second title was Superman Smashes the Klan by Jean Luen Yang, a comic book based off of a radio show that is widely credited with taking the piss out of the Klan and helping pave the way to its second demise. Quote, the year is 1946, and the Lee family has moved from Chinatown to downtown Metropolis. While Dr. Lee is eager to begin his new position at Metropolis Health Department, his two kids, Roberta and Tommy, are more excited about being closer to the famous superhero, Superman. Tommy adjusts quickly to the fast pace of their new neighborhood, befriending Jimmy Olsen and joining the club baseball team, while his younger sister Roberta feels out of place when she fails to fit in with the neighborhood kids. She's awkward, quiet, and self-conscious of how she looks different from the kids around her, so she sticks to watching people instead of talking to them. While the Lees try to adjust to their new lives, an evil is stirring in Metropolis. The Ku Klux Klan. The Klan targets the Lee family, beginning a string of terrorist attacks that kidnap Tommy, attack the Daily Planet, and even threaten the local YMCA. But with the help of Roberta's keen skills of observation, Superman is able to fight the Klan's terror while exposing those in power who support them. And Roberta and Superman learn to embrace their own unique features that set them apart. From multi-award-winning and New York Times bestselling author Jean Luen Yang comes an exciting middle-grade tale featuring Superman. Moving along to liberative struggles related to gender and sexuality, we have 4 titles to look at. First off, we have Be Gay, Do Comics, an anthology of comics previously published on the website The Nib. Quote, the dream of a queer separatist town, the life of a gay and Jewish Nazi fighter, a gender reveal party that tears apart reality. These are just some of the comics you'll find in this massive queer comics anthology from the Nib. Be Gay, Do Comics is filled with dozens of comics about LGBTQIA experiences, ranging from personal stories to queer history, to cutting satire about pronoun panic and brands desperate to co-opt pride. Brimming with resilience, inspiration, and humor, an incredible lineup of top indie cartoonists takes you from the American Revolution through Stonewall to today's fight for equality and representation. End quote. Then I couldn't help but want to highlight a graphic novel, The Pervert by Remy Boydell and Michelle Perez. Quote, a surprisingly honest and touching account of a trans girl surviving through sex work in Seattle, with excerpts published in Eisner-nominated anthology Island. The full-color volume drawn and painted by Remy Boydell is an unflinching debut graphic novel. Looking at the history of being black and gay in so-called North America, Knockout, the true story of Emil Griffith by Reinhard Kleist, follows the life of one multifaceted man as he lives through history. Quote, the American boxing champion Emil Griffith gained notoriety in 1962 when he brutally defeated the Cuban fighter Benny Perret. 10 days after the fight, Perret, who had directed a homophobic slur at Griffith during the weigh-in, died from his injuries. In Knockout, Reinhard Kleist draws a powerful, emotive portrait of a bisexual African-American athlete who, facing racism and homophobia in 1960s America, found success in the world of boxing. It's the story of a fierce and ambitious fighter and of a knockout blow that ended one life and changed a second forever. End quote. To conclude, I also wanted to recommend a recent read, The Magic Fish by Trung Le Nguyen. Beautiful and intricate, I appreciated the way I got to see a coming out story through fresh eyes. Quote, Tien loves his family and his friends, but Tien has a secret he's been keeping from them, and it might change everything. An amazing YA graphic novel that deals with the complexity of family and how stories can bring us together. Real life isn't a fairy tale, but Tien still enjoys reading his favorite stories with his parents from the books he borrows from the local library. It's hard enough to communicate with your parents as a kid, but for Tien, he doesn't even have the right words because his parents are struggling with their English. Is there a Vietnamese word for what he's going through? Is there a way to tell them he's gay? A beautifully illustrated story by Trung Le Nguyen that follows a young boy as he tries to navigate life through fairy tales, an instant classic that shows us how we are all connected. The Magic Fish tackles tough subjects in a way that's accessible with readers of all ages and teaches us that no matter what, we can all have our own happy endings. End quote. Next up, I want to highlight some books that I feel helped me better understand disability justice struggles. Firstly, we have Dumb, Living Without a Voice, a memoir by Georgia Weber. Quote, part memoir, part medical cautionary tale, Dumb tells the story of how an urban 20-something copes with the everyday challenges that come with voicelessness. Weber adroitly uses the comics medium to convey the practical hurdles she faced as well as the fear and dread that accompanied her increasingly lonely journey to regain her life. Her raw cartooning style occasionally devolving into chaotic scribbles, splotches of ink and overlapping montage perfectly capture her frustration and anxiety. But her ordeal ultimately becomes a hopeful story. Throughout she learns to lean on the support of her close friends, finds self-expression in creating comics, and comes to understand and appreciate how deeply her voice and identity are intertwined. End quote. Struggling through a second year of pandemic living, I found myself unsurprisingly drawn to Taking Turns, Stories from HIV/AIDS Care Unit 371 by M.K. Zurich. Quote, in 1994, at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the United States, M.K. Zurich took her first nursing job at Illinois' Masonic Medical Center in Chicago as part of the caregiving staff of HIV/AIDS Care Unit 371. Taking Turns pulls back the curtain on life in the ward. A shining example of excellence in the treatment and care of patients, Unit 371 was a community for thousands of patients and families affected by HIV and AIDS, and the people who cared for them. This graphic novel combines Zurich's memories with the oral histories of patients, family members, and staff. It depicts life and death in the ward, the way the unit affected and informed those who passed through it, and how many look back on their time there today. Zurich joined Unit 371 at a pivotal time in the history of AIDS. Death from the syndrome in the Midwest peaked in 1995 and then dropped dramatically in the following years with the release of antiretroviral protease inhibitors. This positive turn of events led to the decline in patient populations and ultimately to the closure of Unit 371. Zurich's restrained, inviting drawing style and carefully considered narrative examine individual, institutional, and community response to the AIDS epidemic, as well as the role that art can play in the grieving process. Deeply personal yet made up of many voices, this history of daily life in a unique AIDS care unit is an open, honest look at suffering, grief, and hope among a community of medical professionals and patients at the heart of the epidemic. End quote. Which brings us to the final section I wanted to highlight today, namely the Just for Fun section. A section I think you all will find entertaining, even if a direct connection to leftist politics may be even more tentative than the rest. First off, we have Pizza Punks by Cole Pauls, a collection of zines and school assignments that all center around punks eating pizza at shows. Fluorescent, literally fluorescent orange to be exact, an ode to a wonderful food and free people. The final book I wanted to highlight before wrapping things up was Static Shock: Rebirth of the Cool by Dwayne McDuffie et al. An early black working class superhero in the hands of a black creative team. It was so good. Quote, threatened by high school bullies and ignored by girls, Virgil Hawkins' life changed dramatically when a mutagenic gas accidentally gave him superhuman abilities. Virgil was reborn as Static, the electrically powered teen superhero. And while Static tries to balance the pressure of his schoolwork, after-school job, and family life, he also protects his inner-city neighborhood against villains, including Holocaust and Commando X. End quote. And that's all they wrote. Welcome all y'all that are still here to a very select club of people who make it to the end of these overly long videos. Let me know in the comments if you are interested in reading any of these titles or have any you think I should read this next year. Reflecting like this does go a ways to keeping me on track. Bye y'all, keep reading, and organized end capitalist oppression. And as always, Literally Graphic is created on land that should be given back to the traditional landholders, which in this case is, to my knowledge, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, non-Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation.